What if the small boats capable of choking off one of the busiest waterways on the planet are sitting inside a mountain right now, tucked behind solid rock, just waiting for a signal to move? That's not speculation. That's a documented, confirmed part of Iran's military strategy. And this past month, the United States went straight at it, hitting the exact locations analysts had been warning about for years. Before we get into exactly what happened, do one quick thing for me. Hit like, tap subscribe, and send this to that one friend who always asks you whether something online is actually real or just noise, because this story is real, and by the end of this video, you'll know precisely how we know that, sources and all. Let's build the full picture first, because a lot of people jumping into this story right now missed the months that led up to it, and without that background, none of the recent strikes actually make sense. This war didn't start suddenly out of nowhere either. Tensions between Iran and its neighbors, along with the United States, had been building for years before the actual fighting broke out, shaped by nuclear negotiations that repeatedly collapsed, sanctions that tightened and loosened depending on who held power in Washington, and a series of smaller incidents in the Gulf that never quite escalated into full conflict, right up until the moment they finally did. Back at the end of February this year, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated operation against Iran that reshaped the entire region within days. Iran's top leadership was hit hard in that opening move, along with several senior military commanders. Iran called it an act of war. Washington and Israel called it a necessary strike to stop a far bigger threat before it could unfold. Within hours, missiles were flying in both directions across the region. Within days, this had grown into the largest open conflict the Middle East had seen in a generation, pulling in allies, oil markets, and shipping routes that the entire world depends on. Now here's the part that matters most for understanding this specific story. In the weeks right after that opening strike, American and Israeli air power went hard after Iran's navy. Ports were hit, bases were hit, ships were struck sitting in harbor before they ever had a real chance to leave port. If you looked at satellite images from March, you would have assumed Iran's ability to fight at sea had basically been wiped out entirely, but it hadn't been. And understanding exactly why is really the whole point of what we're covering today. It's worth pausing here to ask why Iran would invest so heavily in a strategy built around losing individual battles while still holding on to long-term leverage. The answer comes down to something fairly simple once you think it through. Iran doesn't need to defeat the United States Navy in a direct confrontation to achieve its underlying goal. It only needs to remain a persistent, credible enough threat that global shipping companies, insurance markets, and foreign governments keep factoring in the risk of disruption every single time they plan a route through the Strait of Hormuz. That kind of lingering uncertainty, spread out over months and years, could be worth more strategically than any single naval victory ever could be, and it costs a fraction of what a traditional battle fleet would require to build and maintain. Iran figured out decades ago that it could never build a navy capable of standing toe-to-toe with the United States. Massive warships, aircraft carriers, destroyers. That was simply never a fight Iran could realistically win. And its military planners understood that clearly a long time ago. So instead of trying to match American firepower ship for ship, Iran built something completely different. Thousands of small, fast, inexpensive attack boats, boats that cost almost nothing compared to a single frigate. Boats that can carry missiles or torpedoes, boats that are difficult to spot, difficult to track, and easy to replace the moment one is lost. And here's the part that genuinely deserves respect as a piece of military planning, even if you have zero interest in strategy or warfare. Iran didn't just build these boats, it built homes for them, carved directly into the rocky southern coastline and into a handful of strategically placed islands, sitting right inside the Strait of Hormuz. Iran spent years cutting tunnels and caves straight into the mountains along its coast, creating hidden harbors built into solid stone where these fast boats could shelter safely, refuel, rearm, and launch again within minutes of receiving an order. From above, from satellites, from a warship's radar, all you see is empty coastline, rock, cliffs, nothing worth noting. Then a hidden opening appears and boats pour out towards you, the shipping lanes before anyone even has time to react properly. That single detail explains why, months into this war, after the United States had already destroyed most of Iran's visible surface fleet, officials were still describing Iranian fast boats as an active, serious threat that could not simply be written off. Because the ships you can see clearly on satellite imagery were never the ships that actually mattered most in this story. The ones hidden inside a mountain are, it's a strategy built almost entirely on patience and concealment, rather than raw firepower, and that's precisely what has made it so frustratingly durable for anyone trying to bring it to a decisive end. Now let's walk through exactly what's happened over the past several weeks, because this is where the real story picks up. And I want to go through it carefully because there's a real difference between what's actually confirmed and what people online tend to exaggerate for views. Before we get into the specific dates and numbers, it helps to understand just how important the Strait of Hormuz actually is to the entire global economy, because that context explains why the United States has poured so much attention and so many resources into this one narrow stretch of water. A significant share of the world's seaborne oil passes through this single choke point every single day. It's barely wide enough in places for two large tankers to comfortably pass one another. Close it down, even partially, even temporarily, and oil prices swing hard within hours. Insurance costs for shipping companies spike overnight, and countries on every continent feel the ripple effects at the gas pump within days. That's exactly why Iran built its entire coastal defense strategy around this single waterway in the first place. It's not really about controlling territory in any traditional sense. It's about holding leverage over something the entire planet depends on, without ever needing a navy powerful enough to fight the United States directly in open water. In early July, after Iranian forces struck several commercial vessels near Oman, U.S. Central Command launched a massive response. Public statements confirmed the United States hit more than 80 separate targets across southern Iran in a single coordinated operation. Air defense systems, command centers, coastal radar installations, anti-ship missile sites, and according to Central Command's own published numbers, more than 60 Islamic Revolutionary Guard fast attack boats, many of them positioned in or near the exact islands we're talking about. Qeshm Island, Bandar Abbas, a coastal town called Sirik. These are the precise locations analysts have pointed to for years as the true heart of Iran's hidden coastal boat network. That wasn't a single isolated event either. Through the middle of July, Central Command carried out additional rounds of strikes, each one publicly described as larger than the last. One American official told reporters that a mid-July operation was 4 to 5 times bigger in scope than the strike that came before it. Iranian state media reported explosions at Qeshm and at Kish Island, another location closely tied to Iran's coastal military presence. Iran's own semi-official news agency reported multiple blasts at Sirik in a single night alone. On the American side, Central Command confirmed it was targeting coastal surveillance systems, missile storage facilities, and maritime strike capability, specifically aimed at reducing Iran's ability to threaten ships moving through the Strait of Hormuz. And then, more recently, after Iran attempted a strike against American forces stationed in the region, the United States responded again. This time, Central Command described the operation as a powerful response, striking military command centers, missile and drone facilities, coastal surveillance sites, and what officials specifically called maritime capabilities. Explosions were reported across an unusually wide stretch of Iran's coastline. Bushehr, Kish Island, Abbas, Qeshm Island again. One American official described the scale of that particular night's bombing as roughly double the size of the operation that preceded it. What's striking, if you actually line up these operations one after another on a timeline, is how consistently the same handful of locations keep reappearing. Qeshm, Bandar, Abbas, Sirik, Kish, Bushehr. This isn't a scattered bombing campaign hitting random points along a long coastline. It's a repeated, deliberate return to the exact same cluster of sites, night after night, week after week, which tells you something important on its own. If a single strike had actually finished the job at any of these locations, there would be no reason to come back and hit the same coordinates again a week later. The fact that Central Command kept returning to Qeshm, kept returning to Bandar Abbas, kept returning to Sirik is itself a quiet admission that whatever damage was done in the previous round wasn't the end of the story. It was one more layer peeled back off something built specifically to absorb exactly this kind of repeated punishment. So if you're watching this and thinking, wait, didn't they already deal with most of Iran's navy back in March? You're right to feel a little confused. And honestly, that confusion is exactly why this story deserves a proper breakdown instead of a 5-second headline that oversimplifies everything. The large visible warships were mostly dealt with early in this war. What's kept dragging on for months, strike after strike, is this much harder problem, reaching boats that aren't sitting out in open water where anyone can see them, but hidden deep inside carved-out rock, sometimes behind reinforced doors, sometimes with more than one hidden entrance, all of it built specifically to survive exactly the kind of sustained bombing campaign that's been running against it for months now. If this kind of careful, honest breakdown is exactly why you keep coming back to this channel, do me a favor right now. Tap that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this conflict is still actively moving. And I don't want you to miss the next major update by accident, especially with how quickly things have been shifting lately. Now, let's talk about why these hidden coastal bases have been so incredibly difficult to fully knock out, because this is genuinely one of the toughest challenges in modern warfare. And understanding it will change how you read every future headline about this. War. Picture solid rock, sometimes hundreds of meters thick, sitting between a bomb and its intended target. That's not a wall that simply collapses the way a building does under pressure. That's natural armor, shaped by the planet itself over millions of years. And no amount of modern engineering makes punching through that quick or easy. To actually destroy a facility like this properly, you need specialized weapons designed to bury deep before detonating. You need extremely precise intelligence on exactly where the internal chambers are located, because if you only crater the entrance without touching what's sheltered inside, the boats are still sitting there completely safe, ready to roll back out the moment repairs are finished. And even then, if a base has multiple entrances, which many of these do by careful design, sealing one doorway doesn't mean the entire facility is finished. It might simply mean the boats leave from a different opening a few days later, business as usual. This is really the entire logic behind why Iran chose to carve these bases into mountains instead of building simple boat sheds along the beach. A boat shed gets flattened in a single pass. A mountain doesn't. Iran's military planners clearly understood that a bombing campaign against hardened, hidden, spread-out infrastructure like this becomes slow, expensive, and genuinely frustrating for whoever is trying to shut it down completely, even with total control of the skies above. And that's precisely what we're watching unfold right now. Strike after strike, week after week, against a threat that keeps surviving largely because of where it chooses to hide. There's a specific tactic that makes these boats especially dangerous once they actually do come out into open water. And it's worth understanding clearly because it explains why the United States and its allies take this threat so seriously, even though these are individually tiny boats compared to a full-sized warship. It's called swarming. Instead of one boat trying to fight a warship directly, a fight it would lose badly, and immediately, dozens of small boats launch at the same time from scattered, hidden locations and converge on a single target from multiple directions all at once. Some carry missiles, some carry torpedoes. The goal was never to win a fair, even fight. The goal is to overwhelm a ship's defenses purely through sheer numbers and unpredictability. Coming from angles, a single crew simply cannot watch all at once, no matter how well trained they are. There's actual footage from years before this current war even began, showing Iranian fast boats practicing exactly this kind of formation near a U.S. destroyer, closing distance from several directions at once while warnings went out over the radio in real time. That's not some theoretical, hypothetical threat drawn up on a whiteboard somewhere. That's a rehearsed, practiced maneuver that Iran's forces have trained for repeatedly over the years. This approach to naval warfare didn't appear overnight either. It's the product of decades of careful, deliberate planning by a country that watched conventional militaries around the world get outspent and outgunned by the United States again and again, and decided early on that trying to compete on those exact terms would be a losing strategy from the very start. Military analysts sometimes describe this general approach as asymmetric warfare, essentially building an entire defense doctrine around your opponent's specific weaknesses rather than trying to match their obvious strengths head-on. A single American destroyer represents an enormous investment in steel, technology, and trained personnel. A single fast attack boat represents a tiny fraction of that cost. When you can force an opponent to spend enormous amounts of money and attention neutralizing a threat that costs almost nothing to build and replace, you've already won a meaningful part of the underlying economic equation, even if you never win a single direct engagement on the water. That's the quiet logic sitting underneath everything we've discussed so far in this video, and it's a big part of why this specific threat has proven so difficult to fully eliminate, no matter how many strikes get launched against it. Now, I want to be honest with you about something, because I think a lot of coverage circulating online right now is overselling what's actually been confirmed, and I would much rather you hear the accurate version from me than get excited about a headline that isn't quite true once you look closely. What is genuinely confirmed, based on Central Command's own public statements and multiple independent news outlets, is that the United States has repeatedly and heavily struck the military infrastructure surrounding these coastal hideouts. Missile sites, radar command centers, surface boats caught out in the open water, dozens of confirmed fast attack boats destroyed in these operations. What I have not seen confirmed anywhere, not from Central Command and not from any outlet doing serious, careful reporting, is a specific claim that American forces have actually breached or fully collapsed the hardened tunnel systems themselves, the actual carved rock chambers where these boats shelter deep inside the mountain. That distinction genuinely matters here. Hitting the coastline and the surrounding infrastructure hard is very real and very well documented. Claiming the underground shelters themselves have been dozens of confirmed completely is a much bigger claim in these operations. And right now, that isn't something what I have not seen confirmed anywhere. Not if you come across Someone stating that with serious, careful reporting confidence is a specific claim that American forces have actually breached or fully collapsed the hardened tunnel systems themselves. There's also the actual carved rock chambers easy to lose sight of when you're only watching strike footage and reading numbers. The distinction genuinely matters here. Hitting the coastline and the surrounding infrastructure hard is military zone far removed from ordinary life. These coastal areas have towns, workers, and families living nearby, going about their daily routines. Reports coming out of Iran describe civilian harm resulting from these waves of strikes, including people with no connection whatsoever to military operations or decision-making. In one widely reported incident, a desalination plant on Qeshm Island, a facility that supplied drinking water to dozens of nearby villages, was damaged during this period, cutting off clean water access for tens of thousands of ordinary residents who had absolutely nothing to do with fast boats or military tunnels. Whoever was ultimately responsible for that specific strike, and the two sides blamed each other publicly. The outcome for the families living there was the same either way, a basic necessity of daily life suddenly gone. That reality doesn't erase the military significance of these particular targets, but it does mean the story isn't purely a hardware story, and it really shouldn't be treated like one when we talk about it. Let's zoom out for a moment, because there's a bigger piece of this entire puzzle that a lot of people miss completely. Strikes are only half of the pressure campaign currently running against Iran. The other half is a naval blockade, and honestly, it might matter even more in the long run than any single night of bombing. Since the United States reinstated a blockade on Iranian ports, the economic damage has been genuinely staggering. Billions of dollars in lost oil revenue, hundreds of millions more draining away every single day the blockade continues, hitting an economy that was already deeply strained from years of sanctions long before this war ever began. Ships have been intercepted, some have been seized outright by naval forces, and yes, a few vessels have still managed to slip through here and there because no blockade in history has ever been completely airtight. But the overall economic bleeding is real, and it's constant day after day, with no sign of stopping. So picture the complete situation Iran is dealing with right now, all at once. Direct military strikes hammering its coastline and its hidden boat network on one side. A massive economic chokehold slowly draining its resources on the other side. Both pressure campaigns running simultaneously, clearly designed to reinforce each other and work toward the exact same outcome, ending Iran's ability to threaten one of the most economically important waterways on the entire planet. The ripple effects of all this have reached far beyond Iran's own coastline too, which is worth understanding if you want the full picture rather than just the military side of the story. Every time a fresh round of strikes or a fresh naval incident makes headlines, oil markets react almost immediately. Brent crude has swung sharply on more than one occasion this year, sometimes posting its biggest single-day jump in years within hours of new fighting breaking out near the strait. Shipping companies have quietly rerouted vessels, added war risk insurance premiums, or paused transits through the strait altogether during the tensest stretches of this conflict, even when no ship was actually hit that particular week. Countries far from this region, dependent on oil and gas that normally flows through this exact corridor, have watched every escalation nervously, because a serious disruption here doesn't stay a regional story for very long. It becomes a global one within days, showing up in fuel prices and shipping delays on the other side of the world. And here's the wrinkle that makes this whole story genuinely more layered and interesting than a simple good guys versus bad guys headline. Destroying most of Iran's visible navy back. In the opening weeks of this war, did not actually stop companies have quietly rerouted to threaten the Strait of Hormuz war risk insurance premiums. Analysts who track this conflict closely altogether have consistently pointed out of this conflict that Iran's larger conventional ships was actually were never really the core of this threat in the first place. The real disruptive power was always sitting quietly in those hidden coastal bunkers, in boats too small and too well concealed to easily eliminate from the air, no matter how advanced the aircraft involved happened to be. Which means sinking the expensive visible warships back in March, as dramatic as that looked on camera at the time, barely touched the actual capability that's kept this fight dragging on for months since, a point worth sitting with, since it says as much about the limits of air power as it does about Iran's own planning. And there's one more layer worth mentioning here before we get into what all of this actually means, because it connects directly to everything we've just walked through together. Iran hasn't only been sheltering fast boats inside these coastal bases. There's also serious mine-laying capability tied up on the same infrastructure network. Barely touched the actual naval mines are a genuinely underrated threat when people think about modern maritime warfare. Worth sitting with. Unlike a missile, a mine doesn't need a crew standing by, as it does about Iran's continuous guidance from anyone. There's one more layer worth mentioning
quietly
here
in a
before
shipping
we
lane
get
for
into
weeks
what
at a time,
all of this actually
waiting
means,
patiently for the wrong
because it
ship
connects
to pass
directly
over
to
it.
everything we've just walked
Clearing
through
mines
together.
safely and thoroughly.
Iran hasn't only
is
been
slow,
sheltering
careful,
fast boats
genuinely
inside
dangerous
these
work,
coastal bases.
and it becomes even
Visible
more
warships
dangerous
back
when
in
the
March.
area
Being cleared is also defended by hidden fast boats capable of swarming in from multiple directions at once. Even in a scenario where all fighting stopped completely tomorrow, that lingering underwater threat wouldn't simply vanish overnight. It would take real time, real risk, and real resources to fully and safely clear. Before we move toward the ending, here's your third and final reminder, and I'm going to handle this one a little differently than the earlier ones. Drop a single word in the comments right now, just type coastline if you've made it this far into the video, because I genuinely want to see how many of you stuck with the full story instead of skipping straight to the end. It helps this channel more than you might think, and I personally read every single comment that comes in. It's also worth asking what analysts actually expect to happen from here, because that's a question worth taking seriously rather than guessing at randomly. Some experts who follow this conflict closely believe the strikes will keep intensifying gradually, following the same pattern we've already seen. Larger operations,
a single word in the
wider
comments
target
right
lists,
now,
just
a slow, grinding effort to degrade.
You've made it
what's
this far
left
into
of
the
Iran's
video
coastal
because
capability,
I genuinely
piece
want to
by
see
piece
how
over
many of
time,
you stuck with the
even if
full
a single
story
knockout
instead
moment
of
never
skipping
actually
straight to the
arrives.
end.
It
Others
helps this
point
channel
toward the
blockade
blockade
as
as
the
the
more
more
decisive
decisive. I personally
long-term
read every
factor,
single comment,
arguing that
in.
even a partially
It's also
intact
worth asking
boat
what
network
analysts
becomes far
actually
less
expect to
dangerous
happen from here,
once the broader economy
because that's a
funding it,
question worth taking
supplying it,
seriously
and
rather
maintaining
than
it
guessing at
is
randomly.
squeezed hard enough
Some
for long
experts who
enough.
follow this conflict, there's
Closely
also a smaller,
believe the
quieter
strikes
group
will
of
keep
analysts
intensifying
watching for
gradually,
signs of
following
diplomatic
the same
movement happening behind the scenes. Since wars this expensive and this damaging to global oil markets tend to eventually produce back-channel talks, even while public statements on both sides stay firm and uncompromising. None of these paths are mutually exclusive. It's entirely possible all three are unfolding simultaneously right now, strikes continuing, the blockade tightening, and quiet conversations happening somewhere far from any camera, each one shaping how this eventually plays out. So where does this actually leave us, once you strip away the dramatic headlines and just look carefully at what's actually confirmed? Here's the honest picture as it stands right now. Iran spent roughly 2 decades building a defensive system, specifically designed to survive exactly the kind of overwhelming air campaign it's currently facing. Hidden fast boats tucked inside hardened coastal caves. A layered military doctrine built entirely around the idea that you don't necessarily need to win a fair fight against a much bigger military power. You simply need to make absolutely sure that military can never fully finish the job it set out to do. And months into one of the most intense, sustained bombing campaigns this region has seen in a generation, with dozens of confirmed strikes hitting the coastline around these hideouts again and again, week after week. That underlying system is still functioning, not untouched, and certainly not unscathed. Genuinely damaged, in fact, with confirmed destruction of dozens of boats and significant infrastructure across multiple locations. But not eliminated either, not completely, not yet. That's not a satisfying, clean ending to this story.
Here's
and
the
I know
honest
that
picture as it stands
there's
right
no
now.
single dramatic moment here.
Iran
Iran
spent
spent
roughly
roughly
2
2
decades
decades
building a
building a
defensive
defensive
system.
system.
It's finally over,
specifically designed
one
to
side
survive
clearly
exactly
won
the
everything
kind of overwhelming air
decisively.
campaign it's currently
What we're actually
facing.
watching unfold is
Hidden
something
fast
slower,
boats tucked
something
inside
messier, and
hardened
honestly,
coastal
something
caves.
far more
A
historically
layered
realistic
military
than most
doctrine
headlines
built
make it
entirely
sound.
around the idea
Sustained
that
pressure
you don't
being
necessarily
applied
need
against
to win a fair
infrastructure that
fight
was deliberately
against a
built
much bigger
to be
military
incredibly
power.
hard
You simply need
to fully destroy
to make
in the first
absolutely
place.
sure that military can
And if history
never
is any
fully
real
finish the
guide here,
job it
conflicts
set out
like
to
this
do.
won't
And
rarely
months
end
into
with
one of the
one
most
perfect
intense,
dramatic
sustained
knockout
bombing
strike that
campaigns
settles
this
everything
region
at
has
once.
seen in a
They tend to wind
generation,
down slowly
with
instead,
dozens of
through
confirmed
some
strikes hitting the
combination of
coastline
exhaustion,
around these
mounting
hideouts again
economic
and
pressure,
again,
and quiet
week
diplomatic
after week.
movement happening carefully
That underlying
in the background.
system is still
All
functioning,
while the visible strikes
not untouched,
continue making
and certainly
headlines
not
up front of the
unscathed.
cameras.
Genuinely
It's worth
damaged,
remembering,
in fact,
too, that wars
with
like
confirmed
this one
destruction
rarely
of dozens
stay
of boats
contained to a
and
single
significant
storyline for
infrastructure
very
across
long.
multiple
What
locations.
starts as a fight
But not
over
eliminated
coastal
either,
bases and
not
shipping
completely,
lanes
not yet.
can quietly
That's
reshape
what's
alliances,
actually
trade
confirmed.
relationships, and regional politics.
Here's the honest. For years after the last strike is ever launched, the countries watching this conflict from the sidelines right now, the ones buying oil, ensuring cargo ships, or simply hoping the price of fuel doesn't spike again next month, are all quietly factoring this coastline into decisions that have nothing directly to do with Iran at all. That's really the hidden scale of this story. It looks, on the surface, like a series of strikes against a handful of islands and port towns. Underneath that surface, it's connected to almost everything, moving through the global economy right now in ways most people watching the headlines never stop to consider. And maybe that's the actual deeper lesson buried inside this entire story, once you really sit with it. It's not really about boats or caves or bombs at all, not at its core. It's about what happens when a smaller military power refuses to fight the exact fight everyone else expects it to fight, and instead builds something patient and deliberately hidden. something specifically designed to outlast the headlines rather than win. One single dramatic battle in front of cameras. Whether you personally think that particular strategy is impressive engineering or something far darker and more troubling depends entirely on which side of this war you happen to be watching it from. But either way, actually understanding it is the real difference between genuinely knowing what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now and simply reacting to whatever dramatic title happens to be trending today without any real context behind it. There's a broader takeaway here too, one that stretches well beyond this specific stretch of coastline. Modern conflicts increasingly aren't decided purely by who has the biggest, most advanced military hardware sitting on a base somewhere. They're shaped just as much by patience, by geography, by clever use of terrain, and by a willingness to absorb repeated punishment without folding completely. Iran's coastal strategy is a case study in exactly that kind of thinking, whether or not you agree with the cause it's serving. It's a reminder that raw firepower, while enormously powerful, doesn't automatically translate into a fast or clean resolution once the other side has spent years preparing, specifically for that exact kind of overwhelming pressure. And that lesson tends to apply well beyond the Persian Gulf, showing up again and again throughout military history whenever a smaller force decides to build around its weaknesses instead of pretending they don't exist. I'll keep tracking this story closely, because it genuinely isn't finished yet, not even close. The moment there's something new and properly confirmed, whether that's coastal bunkers actually breached for real, a serious diplomatic breakthrough, or anything else that meaningfully changes this picture, I'll bring it to you straight, sourced properly, without the exaggeration so much of the internet seems to run on right now. Until then, stay sharp, stay genuinely curious, and stay skeptical of anyone online promising you an instant, total, one-sided victory in a conflict this layered and this deeply rooted. Some fights aren't won in a single night of headlines. Some fights are won slowly, underground, the earlier out of sight. One single word in the comments right now, just one quiet decision at a time. You've made it this far into the video, whether we like the pace of it or not, want to see is still being written right now, full story instead of along the coastline. Most people will never see. It helps this channel more than you might think. And I personally read every single comment that comes in. Inside carved-out mountains that most actually only ever glimpse here, a satellite photo, because that's a question worth grainy strike footage rather than guessing at random.